Hello, everyone. This is Dee Marley with the History Bards podcast and my co-host, Michael Zucker.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And this week, we are interviewing historical author Lars D.H. Hedbor, featuring his series, Tales from the Revolution. Lars, we are so glad to have you on the show today. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, and I'm awfully glad to be here. Thank you very much.
Good. We are so glad to have you visit on today, and as a way of a brief introduction for our listeners, I must say that I really enjoyed reading your bio on Amazon, on your Amazon page, and how readers kind of learn more through well-researched stories than through dry recitation of facts. I really liked that. And you know, you mentioned that we are wired to respond to stories of fellow human beings, and I'd like to really know, is this one of the reasons that drove you to start writing historical fiction?
Absolutely. I like most people. I went to school and studied history, and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't the thing that I went to school for. It wasn't the reason that I showed up at the door every morning. But what really did turn me on was reading some really great historical fiction. So I was a little bit of a precocious reader. I read Roots at the age of 10 or 11, and if your listeners haven't encountered that book yet, it's a fairly thick volume,
right?
And it's got some fairly adult scenes in it that are challenging, but I got through that, and through reading that story, I got very much more interested in the history that Alex Haley was presenting there. Mm-hmm. So that early experience definitely shaped my perception of historical fiction.
And what a way to start into historical fiction, by reading Roots.
I didn't start with light stuff at all.
No, you didn't. But I think that's amazing. And you're right, for anybody who hasn't read that book, which that seems really odd if no one has, but yeah, that's a great start. Yep. For anybody.
It's a little bit of an older book now. It's a little bit of a classic.
Yes,
but,
yes.
And the other series that really changed my approach to historical fiction was Wilhelm Moberg's The Emigrant series, which is about Swedish immigrants coming over to the U.S. And I read that one, I think, when I was in high school. My family, my father's family came over from Sweden, so it was something that I wanted to connect with.
Right.
And it really drove home to me the power of story to help us understand historical facts and historical context. Mm-hmm. Because we can memorize a series of dates, and we can memorize dates and names and regurgitate them on a test and pass the test.
Right.
But that doesn't help us to really understand why the people did the things they did, how they felt about the things they were doing, and what the effects were today of the events that we memorized and forgot.
Right, which kind of leads into the reasons why you wrote Tales of a Revolution, or Tales from a Revolution. A very prolific series, I must say. You've done really well with that. And I'm going to let Michael kind of take this over, because he's a huge fan of American history himself.
Awesome.
So go for it.
Yeah, this is certainly one of the episodes I was really looking forward to, given the topic. So normally I would ask, why did you, what part of the revolution did you choose to engage in? But since it's such a such a large series, as you want to talk about where you started, kind of how it developed, sort of how you engage with the different aspects of that era.
So what I'm trying to do with the Tales from a Revolution series is I want to explore how the revolution unfolded, not just in Boston and New York and Philadelphia, but across all of the different places where that conflict took place. I got started writing it, I was talking to a friend of mine who had gone to college in the Carolinas, and he kept telling me, "Oh, all this amazing stuff that happened during the Revolution in the Carolinas." I said, "Really?" Because you only ever hear about the South with the Civil War. And so I asked him if he had any recommendations for for some good historical fiction, because I knew that was how I learned history best. And he looked around and he says, "Well, it looks like Jimmy Carter wrote one." I was like, "Oh, really? I like his poetry. We don't have to talk about his politics, but his poetry is excellent." So I picked up that book, and it wasn't as good as his poetry. And so I kind of uttered those famous last words. I said, "I think I can do better myself."
Wow.
And I sat down and I wrote the Declaration, which is my South Carolina book. And what I'm working on doing is writing one novel for each of the colonies, as well as some of the future states. And I'm really trying to focus on the stories of ordinary people, because we've all heard about Washington and Jefferson, and now we get Hamilton, but we hardly ever hear about people like you and I, who were being overwhelmed by these events that were unfolding around them, sometimes taking part in those events, and in many cases shaping those events through the decisions that they made in their day-to-day lives. And the bigger lesson that I take from writing these and from reading the doing the research that I do is that we don't have to make it into the history books to change history.
Yeah.
Right, that's a great line.
Yeah.
So are the characters in your books, are they based on real people, or are they fictional?
By and large, fictional. I do have a few real characters. I avoid the major historical figures for a number of reasons. First of all, they've been done to death. I don't have a whole lot to add to what Lin-Manuel Miranda did with Hamilton. I can't really flesh out his life anymore. And then I read other people who've done an even more in-depth job, and I'm like, yeah, no, they can have that. The other thing is a practical reason, and that's that it's really easy to get something wrong. And I had one short scene in my book, The Prize, where Benedict Arnold makes a short appearance up in Vermont. He was leading the forces that opposed the British up there, and sailed down the lake, being chased by the British. So he has a very brief scene in that book, and I talk about his flashing blue eyes. And a couple of years later, I was reading a biography of him, and it made a reference to his distinctive green eyes. So what I don't want to do is, I don't want to, for a reader who's knowledgeable about the revolution or some small aspect of the revolution, I don't want to yank them out of the story by saying something that's just dead wrong. So that's my practical reason. And then, my more philosophical reason for focusing on fictional characters who are these ordinary people who didn't make it into the history books at all, is, again, to reiterate to my readers that the choices that you make, the decisions that you make, the things that you do, they will have a ripple effect on into the future. If these characters and the people I write about, they're, I read letters and journals and newspapers and all of that to get a sense of what the real people who lived through these events were thinking and doing, and how they regarded things. So there were people who were like my characters who had to have existed. We know they had to have existed because these things happened. These events took place, and we know that there were this many thousand soldiers who were part of this force. Well, so let's talk about one of those soldiers. Let's see what their life is like. I want to remind my readers that, again, their actions matter.
I think that's really fascinating. Really great.
Yeah. So, or do you want to go next?
Oh, I was just going to say that, with the extensive amount of books that you already have out, I'm sure the research that went into this was very extensive. Can you tell us more about the research?
Yeah. So I typically, I'll start off with a general idea of, I obviously I want to write about this colony, right? And I've come across some event that inspired me to write about that colony, a story that I thought was interesting. So, for example, my Connecticut story is about an old abandoned copper mine that was pressed into service as a prison during the Revolution. And that prison was used to house loyalist soldiers alongside common criminals. And the thing that was interesting about that prison was that it was terrible as a prison. There were many escapes, including one large escape that forms the heart of my story. So I come across that little story, that little kernel, and I'm like, okay, that's a good thing for me to hang my story off of. And then as I'm writing, I'll come across something that one of my characters needs to know, or needs to, because I'm doing my level best to inhabit their world and to reflect that world in my writing. So, if one of my characters, for example, knows how to make butter, I need to know how to make butter. If one of my characters knows how to plant tobacco, well, guess what? I've got to learn how to plant tobacco. And so I fortunately, there's so much just unbelievable wealth of information about that era that's available to us. Just, literally at our fingertips. Now, some of that information is going to be wrong. And so we have to develop a sense of, kind of cross-checking things and making sure that it checks out and makes sense. But I do a lot of research as needed once I've got the kernel of the story that I've picked up from something else that I was reading along the way.
Oh, that's great. And if you're like any of the rest of us, do you have a problem like getting too immersed in your research?
Yes. I once spent a whole night reading from cover to cover somebody's thesis paper on the economics of Caribbean piracy, French Caribbean piracy of the 1750s. And it was fascinating, and it ended up shaping maybe half a page of dialogue in one of my books.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. But isn't that the great thing about historical fiction, though? Whenever you're able to take history and develop a story, that's so much fun.
Yeah. Well, and I love too the little connections that you come across as you're writing. So my novel, The Will, is unusual for me because it's about a real person. It's about an ancestor of mine. And I first came across him as I was doing my genealogy, trying to see if I could qualify for the Sons of the American Revolution. And I discovered that I had this guy who had actually fought in the Revolution. And he was kind of an interesting fellow. The first reference I found to him was in the Congressional Record. And he was called before Congress for having cussed out the president at a tavern in Philadelphia.
What?
Okay, this guy sounds like a character. I need to get to know him better. And it turned out that he had pretty good reasons for doing so. And he was actually dismissed from service by the Congress.
Wow.
This was in early 1776. And then, of course, we had the Declaration of Independence. And shortly thereafter, he writes a letter to the Congress saying, I'm terribly sorry. I know I made a terrible mistake, and I would love to be of service. And here's a few plum positions that I picked out for myself.
Oh, that's really fascinating. So you've piqued everybody's interest to immediately pick that book up.
Yeah.
Which kind of leads me to a side question.
Sure.
Does a person need to read your books in succession? Are they
Absolutely not? No,
okay.
They're all standalone. They take place across so much geography. When I was first starting, I tried to dream up some way to connect them together with a single character. And there weren't many people who moved around the colonies a great deal, who weren't already, these major figures that we know about. Right. So I decided right from the start that each of them would be a standalone story.
That's awesome.
There's little Easter eggs, if you are a close reader of one book, you might notice that a character pop up in another book. I know where he came from.
Okay, that's remarkable that you're able to keep all of that straight.
It gets more complicated with every new title.
Right. Michael?
Well, I actually was going to ask, do the characters, or does each book have its own past, which I guess we just answered. Did the books all operate from the same perspective? Are they all from the Patriot side, or do
No.
they? No, no.
No, actually, I think it's important to understand not just British and American, but all of the different perspectives. So, for example, The Smoke, which is my New York book, tells the story from the perspective of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederation, a member of that confederation, as they were drawn into this war that, that they didn't have any part in it, but they got pulled into it, and the Confederation was actually torn apart by the revolution. The Wind tells the story from the point of view of a Spanish soldier as Spain came in and saved the American Revolution, which is a very little known story. Fantastic sequence of events that I've done my best to do justice to. And then telling the other side, The Break is told from the point of view of a young woman whose father is a loyalist, and they have to evacuate up to Nova Scotia and try to rebuild their lives up there as the Americans continue to wreak havoc and make trouble. And in that book, the Americans are the bad guys, and they were quite badly behaved, let's just say. And I've got a couple of other books that are also told from the other side. The Convention is actually told from the point of view of a British soldier who was part of the defeat in Saratoga. And this was, again, one of those stories that I came across and I was like, really? How did I not know that? You had this army at Saratoga that was taken. And for those who are familiar with American history, Saratoga was the first major American victory. And it was actually the victory that convinced the French to ally with us, that we had we were a going concern. And what I didn't appreciate until I was doing some research for actually the mine, the story of the loyalist prisoners, was that army was taken captive and then remained in captivity for the remainder of the war. They were marched all the way down to Virginia and then back up to Pennsylvania before they were finally released. And so, trying to tell the story from that point of view, from the point of view of an ordinary soldier, ordinary British soldier, who's been sent over to this foreign land to try to, regain control of the restless natives, the restless colonists, I should say, natives. That was an interesting perspective to try to inhabit. And
so that sounds like a real challenge. So that kind of leads into like, what did you find that was most difficult in writing this sort of series?
For me, the biggest difficulty comes when I discover, as I have in my current book in progress, I'm about 3/4, 9/10 of the way through writing it, and realized that I got some basic facts wrong that I'm going to have to go back and rewrite to deal with. And that's a failure of my research at the beginning of the process, and now I'm paying for it. But
we've all been there. It's okay. We've all been there.
Yeah. But that's certainly difficult. And I'll tell you, trying to understand the viewpoint of people who did not leave any records, whether for example, in the will, my main character's wife is basically not in the historical record. Because I'm writing about a real person, I want to reflect the facts as well as I can. And she's just not in the historical record, so I had to make her up from whole cloth. And you hope that you've done justice to this real human being who lived and breathed. And at the same time, at some point you kind of have to, give it to the wind and hope that it lands okay.
Yeah, I used to, there was a question I used to ask, which is pretty valid in historical fiction, about the ethics of writing about a historical figure. And, because you have to be, you have to be true to them. There's some people who will kind of, fudge a little bit on that, but
well,
that's a controversial thing sometimes when it comes up.
certainly writing about characters who owned other human beings is very challenging for me.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of too many books that I've written where I don't have some character who's basically saying that's just flat not okay, and sort of representing that modern viewpoint, and at the same time I'm very careful to make sure that the characters who do speak out against it are speaking out against it in the terms and for the reasons that real people at that time did. And that is a topic that fascinates me. And it's actually, once I finish up my current book, that's the next place I'm going to go, is actually who were engaging in it were aware that it was evil, and some of them resisted that evil even as they engaged in it. Some of them spoke out against it even as they engaged in it. Jefferson is a famous example, of course. He famously tried to include slavery among the evils that Britain had imposed on us, even as he owned human beings and was raping one of his slaves.
Yeah. And again, that's what historical fiction does. It educates, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's a great saying that's been going around recently, that if you're always proud of your history, you probably aren't studying it.
Yeah, that is a very profound statement. Very profound. Michael?
I guess since one thought that I'm having is that the number of different stories, the number of different sort of characters and protagonists, I mean, is how do you keep the different character voices and arcs and, the drama that they're involved in from sort of, how do you keep them separate enough to make them both interesting yet related enough that they're from the same period and it's the same series, and how do you approach that balance?
It's a great question, and it's something that I consciously struggle with. And one thing that I do is, first of all, again, I'm doing my best to inhabit their personas as I'm writing them. And the other thing is, I had one book, actually it was The Wind, where one of the characters started sounding an awful lot like a character in a prior book, so I killed him. and
easy solution.
It was a dramatic, it was definitely a drastic solution. But the thing is that by doing that, I ended up shaping the entire story in ways that were really powerful and wonderful. And so, being willing to take that sort of drastic action to deal with a troublesome character is something that I've found very useful. But again, when I'm writing a character, I'm doing my best to understand what their perspective would have been, and what their voice would have been. So I think I do a pretty good job of giving distinct voices to each of my different protagonists. Of course, I think if you read me closely, you're probably going to find that each of them sound a little bit like me. But I think that's something that almost all authors,
yes.
I read it. I grew up reading Robert Heinlein, and you read his characters closely, and they're all a little bit Robert Heinlein, and that's okay, because you discover that you actually kind of like this old curmudgeon, and it doesn't matter if he's inhabiting a pretty young woman or a grouchy old man. It's the character that you like, and I hope that my readers enjoy the person that I. Whatever bit of myself makes it into my characters.
Oh, that's really fascinating, and thank you for sharing that. That was awesome, Michael.
Yeah, I had a question that I was thinking about asking, but didn't feel appropriate for the show. But if
Oh.
you have a second now, as somebody else who, as another historical fiction writer, since you're focusing, so heavily on like one time period and event, do you ever get, I don't know if the word would be like, I don't want to say bored, but like, does it ever feel like, you would like to try something else, or do you just really have such a passion for that era?
I really love the era, but because of the way that I'm structuring my books, I'm going to run out of colonies eventually.
Yeah.
I've got 2 more of the original 13 to write, and I'm going to get Maryland done next year or this year, and then after that I just have Delaware, and then I've got a few other colonies and future states to hit. So that takes me through probably the next 5 or 10 years. But after that, I'm planning to turn to the early republic. So I'm gonna leapfrog ahead about 50 years, and head into the 19th century. And there are
Awesome.
certainly other eras and places that fascinate me. I would love to write about the Silk Road. That
Yeah.
absolutely, I love that. The Malian Empire in Africa is almost completely unknown, and I don't know of any really great historical fiction that's been written about it. I don't think I'm the right person to tell that story, but I'd sure love to read it.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. That was a great question. You probably so
Sure.
we're getting close to the end of the interview, but before we go, I really would like to know, do you have anything else coming up, or like author events or anything coming out?
So I'm just wrapping up work on my novel of Bermuda. And you say American Revolution, Bermuda? Really? Actually, yes.
Wow.
There was a powder raid, they called it. Basically, Bermuda had a very large storehouse of gunpowder, and they had been cut off from trade because of the interactions between the British government and the American colonies. And so a group of Bermudans took it upon themselves to steal that powder and hand it over to the Americans. And so just a really fascinating little vignette that also lets us understand how global trade was affected, how people who were outside of the whole the whole American Revolution still wound up being deeply affected by this war. So I thought that was a really fascinating story to get to write.
And when is that coming out?
I am anticipating probably August. I
Okay.
was going to try to. I'm hoping to shift my production schedule so that I release every year on July 2nd. I don't think I'm going to make it this year, but that's my hope in the future, is that each of my future books will be released on the date that we declared that we declared independence, which was July 2nd, not July 4th.
Well, that's great. We'll be sure and have a link on our on the Historical Fiction Company's blog whenever that comes out.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lars, for being on the show today. We really appreciate it.
Glad to be here. Thank you so much for the
Very
opportunity.
excited for your books. Very excited.
I sure appreciate it.
And to all our listeners, we thank you and ask that you please click that subscribe button. And once again, you can learn more about Lars and his books at www.larsdhedbor.com. We hope everyone enjoyed today's episode, and tune in next week's show as we interview historical author Eileen Joyce Donovan with her featured book, The Campbell Sisters. Thank you for listening, and as always, keep making history and keep listening.